once you become involved in child welfare and you get some of the experiences with the kinds of things that children go through and the kinds of things their families go through, then the motivation is there to want to make children's lives better, also to help parents to um, be better caregivers and to be able to provide children with the things they need to be nurtured and to be raised so that they can have a reasonably comfortable and emotionally healthy life. So it becomes, what can I correct where I can and what can I prevent where I can. The nature of child welfare is that you are going into families' homes and asking, because I primarily worked doing investigative work. You're going into families' homes and asking parents about alleged problems they have with their kids. So, by definition, it is invasive and offensive because no parent wants to be questioned about their parenting, regardless of who the parent is. So when you come to the door, it is by definition a hostile act, even if nothing has happened. Your presence, it seems like normally at dinner time with this plastic ID card and a piece of paper. That's, if you strip it down, that's what it is. And so then people ideally have to let you in their home and you ask them very personal details about their lives and their parenting styles. You ask to see their kids and talk to them and to actually literally look at their kids. Particularly if there's an allegation of some kind of injury, you've got to look for the injury. And so that process is just, it's emotional to be a part of the person that does it. It's emotional to have to sit and watch a parent go through what they logically and naturally are going to go through when you begin to do what you do. These are people's children. And children see their parents differently than we may see them on the outside. So it could be the fact that the parent may be abusive, but kids don't see them that way a lot of the time. And when they do, it's in retrospect when they're older. They just see mom and dad, and that's what mom and dad do. So it breaks down boundaries in terms of how people normally operate about their personal lives. And so that's a struggle for you as a practitioner. Then sometimes the responses can be pretty emotional, sometimes elevating to hostile. And you have to learn how to de-escalate and get people from a place of high emotion to a place where they can hold a conversation with you, which is a particular skill. And excuse me, you have to be comfortable with being in what can be potentially dangerous environments and still keeping your own focus, because you've got a job to do. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you have to go through that process with every client or family that you visit. And you have to keep all of that in mind while you're sitting in what could be a risk situation. And you also have to be aware of where the risk becomes too much for you to be exposed to, and you have to make a different decision. So there's multiple processing that's going on when you're doing the job, and you have to have all of that working and functioning and fine-tuned every time you have one of these encounters, because you can't not be aware of the client because you need to be respectful. You can't not be aware of the kid because he's the child and you're impacting him or her in a very odd way. You can't not be aware of yourself because you've got to be sure that you're safe. You have to be aware of procedure because there's a way to do an investigation, there's a way to approach a client, and you never want to compromise either for practice purposes or for legal purposes how you conduct an investigation and how you engage with a family. So there's a lot going on once you knock on that door and if you get in that door. A lot of that is just listening to them and kind of reflecting and affirming, because they are right. How dare you come to my home? How dare you? How dare you ask me about the way I raised my child? Why aren't you, and usually what a lot of the times you would hear is, why aren't you going over there to that home where that child died 3 weeks ago? That's the parent that needs to be investigated. and then you have to kind of explain usually you start with what an investigation is, why it has to happen, and what the pieces of it are. And you always start with this is an allegation. And I usually used the analogy that if someone pulls a fire alarm box, every time that alarm is pulled, a fire engine gears up, and those men come out on that engine and they come to the spot where the alarm happened because they have to. And then they figure out whether or not there is a fire. If there's a fire, they put it out. If it's not, it's a false alarm. They go back to the house and they resume what they do until another alarm comes. They come out every time. And then that same way, Child Protective Service workers, when we get a report that's like the fire alarm being pulled, we don't know what's true and what's not true. And the only way to find that out is to go out, look, listen, and talk and find out. If nothing's happened, then we go away. If something has happened, then we need to put the fire out, whatever that fire is. And sometimes that that explanation was helpful in helping parents understand that this is not personal. This happens to do with the fact that the alarm was pulled and somebody's going to come out. A lot of times my last case, depending on how late it was, I would walk home. And part of that was child welfare investigators are really more like detectives than social workers, because you've got an allegation and you've got to determine based on what's written and what you see, what's true, what's not true. If there's an injury, you have to look at the logic of how it's been explained to you. Does it make sense that happened this way? Is that realistic? Could it really have, could a baby that small really have turned over a chair? So you're kind of thinking about it. What was I feeling when I was talking to the parents? What did I notice in the household? Was it in disarray? Were there things that indicated some other kinds of problems? How did the parents ultimately respond to me? So all of that is running through my head. And I usually use that walk to process all of that, to prepare to write my initial report and to have a discussion with my supervisor about what I thought I saw. The other piece of that is just and I recognize now that the walking also gave me time for the adrenaline to recede from my body, because you have to, there's going to be an adrenaline bump in order to do this, in order to walk to somebody's door, a stranger's door in a strange neighborhood, and do what you do. There has to be an adrenaline increase. I didn't think about it then, but I realize it now. So part of that walk intuitively was to walk off the feeling of adrenaline and what it does to your body. Sometimes, particularly toward the end of my time doing investigations, I would just go home and I would just sit in a chair. I couldn't even turn the TV on. I would just sit there and just kind of stare until I kind of calmed down and could focus. And then I would get up and do dinner, turn the TV on, call people, try to do the things that were normal. And sometimes I was just sitting for an hour, just sitting in the middle of my living room, just going, geez, I can't believe I just did that, or geez, I can't believe I just saw that. You're saying I can't believe I just saw that because of some of the things you're seeing that have happened to children, because of some of the living conditions that some families are forced to have to try to manage, because of some of the stories that families tell about what they've been through. Because I found that many of the clients I used to work with have been through so many challenging experiences that if you just poke a little bit at them in terms of questions, it all comes out. And they'll tell you generational stories of abuse and neglect and horror, because you're sitting there and you're listening and you're available. So you don't just get the facts of the report that you came in there to investigate, you get all of this history, all of this pain, all this emotion, all of these things, which they've been holding in. And for some reason, when they see you, they feel like they can tell you, even though you're a stranger, and you're actually a stranger who is in their house, what is by definition in a hostile way. But because many of the clients that I worked with were terribly isolated, it was like it's a listening ear. Um, and so they tell you this stuff, and then it's on you almost palpably, in terms of you almost feel like something is on you, and you have to figure out how you're going to scrape it off and live your life. The one that kind of just flashed in my head was I was out with a colleague. We always tried to partner up when we could because it was just safer. And we were in this home. It was a mom. I don't remember what the allegations were. I don't even remember how many kids there were. But the point was the mom made a phone call while we were talking. And about 10 minutes later, about 12 family members came rushing into the house. And this house had a weird configuration so that you came upstairs to get to the living room. And all of this family came rushing into the house and up the stairs, and they were in between myself and the worker and the exit, which is something that you learn to never to allow to happen if at all possible. You always want to be able to be at an exit if you need to. And so we're just sitting there kind of trapped with folk, looking really irritated and really intense, and just having to sit and again do the same explanation. And a lot of times what you're doing is talking in a very monotone voice, with a very neutral affect, saying the same thing over and over again, and adding comments like, I can understand, how this is upsetting to you, and nobody wants this to happen to them. And of course, you're angry. You should be angry. I would be angry. And you just keep repeating the same thing over and over again. And many, many times, if there's not some factor like maybe drug activity or maybe sometimes some emotional issues, most people, I was able to get to the place where I could at least begin a conversation. Sometimes it didn't happen. Sometimes they said leave my house, and when they did, then I did. And then there are other processes that would occur. They actually, after a while, calmed down. And we were able to get them to leave. It took a while. And to do the beginning part of the investigation, because the investigation has stages, but we were able to do the initial conversation with mother. And if I remember correctly, only one of the kids we needed to see was there. Another one was at another site, and we had to make arrangements to see that other kid. So it turned out not to be that bad. I've had things that were a lot more complicated than that. But just the idea of these people rushing in, it produced a lot of anxiety. But you kind of learn, well, my practice was to not let them see my anxiety, because that put me in a position to be victimized if I looked like I was afraid of them. So even when I was anxious, they didn't get to find that out. Initially, when I first started doing the work, it was the work. And I wasn't aware. I mean, the stories could be bad. The job was stressful. This is the nature of this particular job. And I wasn't really aware of the impact. But over time, I think, and this is ages ago, I haven't looked at the stats in a very long time, but the average national burnout, quote unquote, rate for child protective service workers is about 2 years. So you got a 2-year trajectory of you came to this job pretty normal for you, and 2 years later you're in a very complicated place. So over time, with the increasing caseload, with the complexity of the cases, because what happens is if you're very good at what you do, you get more of what you do. So I was very good at de-escalating hostile clients. So I got all the hostile clients because I could de-escalate them. But then I got a very specific caseload. It wasn't always that, but I got a lot of them because I could talk them down. I knew what my boss knew. But after a while, I'm spending a lot of time with all those people talking them down, talking them down, talking them down. And that's beginning to impact me because I'm getting the same kind of person. Um, the stories begin to stay with you a lot more. Um, you get like little personality changes, like you're a little more testy than maybe you were a year ago. You might begin to isolate a little bit more than you normally would. Um, I was a lot heavier than I am now. And a lot of that was I ate. I ate big lunches and I ate a lot of carbs and a lot of sweets. And that was a way, it was actually self-medication. It was a way to stave off the thoughts and feelings that came from doing the job and which are inevitable in doing the job. If you have any kind of heart, then what you see is going to affect you. Well, for any child welfare worker, the worst outcome is a fatality. And so it's what I think those of us who are honest always fear. And even when something happens and it's not connected to you personally, when you become aware of it, you always have some emotions and some thoughts about it because I think there's a feeling that, well, that could be me. It's not me today, but it could be me tomorrow. I had a situation as a supervisor where there was a death of a minor child, and so many emotions go through your head. I think first of all, it's the call you dread, and you're actually receiving the call, so you're kind of in shock because I think a part of you imagines it. What am I going to do if I get this call? So there's kind of a scenario in your head in a way. And then the call comes and it's like, this can't be real, but it is. So you need to process that. Then, of course, there's a whole, I think it's like everything for me in child welfare, there's kind of a split. There's the procedural piece of my head, which is running the entire time. And there's an emotional thing, which is running simultaneously that I can't really attend to immediately because I've got to do the procedural stuff. Because there are, of course, policies and procedures when there is a death. And so I had to think about those things and start doing what was necessary in responding to agency protocol. And at the same time, I've got this fact that I know I've got a worker connected to this fact that I have to kind of support. And I've got my own things going on. It's on the news. So if I try to watch TV, which at some point when you do this job, you stop watching the news a lot of the times because you don't want to know. Because anytime you hear child and hurt, there's an automatic reaction until you figure out it's not your kid, meaning you're a kid on your caseload. But it's in the paper. People know what you do, so they're asking you about it. They may not, they won't know that it's you, but whenever there's an issue at a child welfare agency, the people that know that you work there are going to ask you questions about, well, what happened with that kid? And something else happened at the agency, huh? It's like, oh my goodness, well, and that whole piece. So you kind of can't get away from it. And you have to figure out really just how to manage walking down the hallway because you're encountering your peers. And part of what you already know is they're having emotions about it. There's almost like a literal cloud that comes over the agency, and there's a kind of a sadness that you see in everybody. So you're thinking about them and you're thinking about you're thinking about the kid, particularly if there's a kid that you've actually seen. In this case, I had never met the child, which is normal because I supervised. But there have been fatalities where I knew the kid. Particularly this one because the worker would bring the kid to the office for supervised visits. So I knew this child. And that was like, I can't believe that kid was just here in a playpen. In fact, I was handing her stuff 2 weeks ago, and now this happened. So there's just this flood of things that nobody's prepared you for technically, and that in your own personal life you wouldn't have any preparation for it, because why should you? And you've got to manage emotions and do your job simultaneously. You have to do both. And then you've got to manage, you help your staff to manage their emotions, because everybody in the unit is going to be impacted by it, because it's his desk Monday, it could be my desk Tuesday, and it's my colleague and I care about him or her. So you've got this mix of things going on. And then you have your own personal life. You've got your life. You have a life that you're living, which with everybody has complications and issues and challenges, and that has to be managed too. So it's a very complex kind of experience. Just the shock of it, just being shocked that it had happened, and just thinking about the fact that this was just a very small child, and um, just frustration, because when you do this job, what you want to do is be sure that kids are safe. And you know that even if you lived with families, there's only so much that you can do in terms of protecting and caring for kids, but you still have this, and I guess that's why you are doing the work. You have this overwhelming feeling of responsibility for caring and protecting for those kids. And you just don't want to ever see anything happen to any of them. And you never want to feel like you missed something. So that was basically the kind of stuff that we talked about, and the kind of feelings. Overwhelming feeling of responsibility, not just a feeling of responsibility. Because working in child welfare, you know that regardless to the circumstances of individual cases, from the outside, it's always going to be, why didn't you do something? Why didn't you save that kid? That's always the way it's presented, as if you, as a professional, have sole responsibility for what happens to children, even though the time you see them is pretty limited when you look at a 24-hour day. It's as if you're expected to have a crystal ball and be able to, predict. And there are of course tools and assessment things that we use that are predictors, but they're of course not 100%, because you can't in any way predict what human beings will do. There have been cases that I've been aware of where workers had just visited a family, and by the time they get from the neighborhood back to the home, there's been a fatality in that home. And there was nothing to indicate that anything was wrong when they left. Human beings are unpredictable and impulsive, and even the best human beings have places where they're not totally in control, and you can't always predict that. You can't always assess that immediately. We do the best we can, many of us, most of the time, but you can't control anyone else's behavior. Well, I got this call, and I was asked if I was the supervisor in this particular case, and I was informed that the child had died from what appeared to be a violent injury. And so I had to go tell my worker that I got the call, and then I had to go tell my boss. And then she began to instruct me on what I needed to do, which started with getting the case file, and because it had to be handed off and go through a chain of people to be reviewed, and then that went to me having to sit with my boss and my staff person, and being asked a series of questions about the circumstances and what we had done and how we had done. Again, they're looking for policy, procedure, and protocol, and did you follow it? And then compare that with the documentation that's in the case to see if it was consistent. And then that led to, of course, my boss having to talk to the next person in the chain of command and explain what she talked to myself and my staff person about. And then I'm sure there were other discussions that I was not privy to that are just a part of the process of looking at what happened. And eventually them coming back and saying that we had followed policy and procedures as expertly as we could considering the circumstances, and that the circumstance was one of information being withheld that we had no way of knowing, which led to the child being exposed to something that we could not anticipate. Well, those calls come from the police because it's a detective normally that's going out to what is now a crime scene. And as soon as the person said that they were a detective, I knew what it was. And as I said earlier, there's the, oh no, this is not really the phone call. Oh yeah, it really is the phone call. Oh my God, what am I going to do? That's kind of the reaction. And then there's the, like I said, the procedural piece of my brain had to kick in because there's things that I had to do right away. But the other part of my brain is still going through that something's happened to a kid, and it's your worst nightmare, and all the implications of that. Because every once in a while I think about how old that kid would be now. She would be X amount of age, had she survived. And I think about, what she didn't get to do because of the fatality. And the piece of me that understands that procedurally we did what we could, that made me feel, I guess the word good is not an exact word. It's more that we were competent in our job. And so that makes me feel good. But the part of me that knows that this kid is still gone still feels sad because this child is still gone. She's gone. So again, it's kind of a double process. I actually didn't start with emotional work because we didn't have time to do that right then. And this was also the kind of person that kind of wouldn't want to do that right then. So we just started doing the procedural stuff. And probably about 3 or 4 days later, I took the staff person to lunch and we sat and talked. Actually, we sat outside, which was intentional so that we could have air and sun, and talked about what we thought and what we felt, and tried to kind of do, I guess, for lack of a better term, a kind of post-mortem of was there anything that we missed, and just kind of process it, because it was our experience as a dyad of sorts. It's what we went through. I mean, the entire unit was impacted by it, but we went through it because that person was the initial investigator and I was the supervisor with ultimate responsibility for, the process on that case. So there was something that the two of us knew about and shared that nobody else was going to understand. So I don't really have a name, and I don't know that it has a specific feeling. For me, and it's probably just the nature of my personality, that the name I put to it is failure. You failed because you have to get it right. You don't get to get it wrong. You don't get to get it wrong, because get it wrong ultimately means fatality. So you don't get to get it wrong. Not saying that we should, but just saying that it's a merciless place to be in. And it doesn't matter how many times you've gotten it right, how many families you've helped, how many people have been turned around, how many people who were angry with you when you first came to the door with the allegation, who are now saying, I'm glad that I got services from you. And I appreciate you pointing out what you pointed out, or I wouldn't have done this had you not said that. None of that matters. When something happens to a kid, all of that is erased, and you've almost got this blinking red light that's just sitting there, and you have to find a way to manage it. It's a loss. So with any loss, I mean, it's a professional loss, but becomes a personal loss. And with any personal loss, eventually you have to get up and figure out how you're going to do the next day. You have to. You don't die. You don't die when people you love die. you get up and you figure out how to do it. And sometimes that's being on automatic for a while and having your life begin to reintegrate back into who you are. Some people just have amazing capacities for resiliency and they just pop back and do it. Some people are permanently wounded, but they still get up and they go on in some way. But if you see them, you know that something about them has changed. Um, but you get up and you go on. You don't stop. You can't stop. Vicarious trauma did not exist when I was practicing directly. People always talked about people being burned out, which I now know is a completely different phenomena. So it's like, oh, that's a burnout. And you would actually hear reference to a person by that term. Um, I started doing certain other things in my profession that brought me into just acquiring information that, upon reflection, let me know that what I was experiencing was vicarious trauma. And one of the things I actually use this story when I talk about it in some of the work that I do. I had stopped doing child protective services and was in a completely different field, and had been in it maybe about like maybe close to 3 years. And in this particular situation, I fell asleep with the TV on. And I was hearing the TV in my sleep and didn't know it. And the news was describing a story of a child welfare system in another state, and about a child who had been placed in foster care. And the child welfare services had gone back to this foster care to retrieve this child for some reason. And the foster mother told them that someone came and got the child 2 years before, and she hadn't seen the child since. And so the issue was nobody knew where this kid was. And I'm hearing this in my sleep, and I heard it, and I sat straight up in my bed, and I could feel my carotid artery just pulsing, and broke out in a sweat. My hands were trembling, and I'm thinking, what area of the city is that case in? And what's the name of that family? Is that one of my families? And it probably was only a second. And then I realized, first of all, you don't do this anymore. And second of all, you don't live in this state. But I had a reaction like it was my case. And that's because that sense of responsibility for any child who's in that system does not easily leave you. And it took me a while to get myself settled down and to go back to sleep. But that is secondary trauma because I'm not even in the field anymore, that area anymore. And I'm still having a visceral reaction to the idea of a child being at risk that's connected to a child welfare system. Because the sensations stay with you. That elevated heart rate, the sense of anxiety, the running cases through your head, um, that foreboding sense that something bad has happened, and a little kid way to describe it is you're going to get in trouble, because that's what it feels like. I'm going to get in trouble. With what goes on in child welfare, the next day we had to get up and do what we had to do. It wasn't like you get this week off. I've got cases that need to be assigned. I've got staff that work or had cases in their drawer, investigations that needed to be completed. Deadlines were due on things. So none of that stops. So you have to get up and do your job because you have to. And then you have to figure the rest of that out on your own, whether that's, I go to a therapist and process it out. I go to a support group and process that out. Within working in child welfare, there's always a lot of, for lack of a better term, informal group supervision. So there are people who are just coming to talk to you. And there are people who was like, when it happened to me 3 years ago, here's what I did, or that kind of thing. Or somebody comes and brings you lunch, or somebody takes you out to lunch. I liked retail therapy a lot. So new earrings happened on a regular basis for me, or new shoes. So, you figure out. What's going to make you be okay? There is a weird kind of change in perception that I think you get when you do this kind of work. You would describe what I did a lot of times to people. If ask them, I would ask them if they ever watched MASH, because that was the closest thing that I could think of that would help someone understand a day in the office. And if you ever watched MASH, you know that their humor was very kind of to the left and probably inappropriate in a normal setting. But for what they were doing and what they had to manage, it served a very emotionally healthy purpose because they were trying to survive in human conditions. And in that way, I think that the work that I did, a lot of things that we would talk about privately, we would find amusing, but we would never say them to anybody else. And it was defensive humor and emotional release humor. So everything I'm thinking about is one of those things, so I can't tell you any of them. A lot funny things would happen in group, and it would more be about a lot of times clients just making a realization about something that we've been talking about, particularly when clients began to tell other clients. Like the facilitators didn't have to say anything. And a client would go, hey, well, the reason you're having that problem is because you keep going blah, 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 blah. You keep doing this particular thing, and this is silly. And, that would sometimes cause all of us to laugh because the client was so blunt with a peer. So that happened a lot. And then the kids were always funny because they're kids. One of the things it does is it makes you more reflective. You really think through your practice as a worker, and as for me as a supervisor, I really thought through in more detail everything that I did. It also kind of gives you a framework for being able to help other people, to support them if they have that kind of encounter. And it gives you greater empathy for those people because intellectually you hear the stories. So this has happened on someone's caseload and you know it's bad, and you read it in the paper and you know it's bad, but you don't really know until it has happened to you. And so it's almost like you're a small unit of people. Again, the same, I talked about the experience between my worker and myself, and that we knew something and had experienced something together that other people could not connect to. In that same way, the larger group of people who have had that loss know something that's unique to that process that no one else will ever know unless they go through it. And so you can support other people who've had that experience in a way that other people can't. Because if you don't have the language, you at least have the emotion and the knowledge of the emotion. That's probably the primary thing, is again just that reflection, which is, I think, immensely important when you do this kind of, when you work with people, you need to always be thinking about the impact of that work and processing the impact of that work, because it just helps you to do it better. And then you can also give support to those who have had a similar loss. I was very fortunate, and I know fortunate is the word, is that I always had really good supervisors. And by that, I don't mean that they counted widgets. I mean that they looked at, and I have to use procedural for a minute, they looked at process with me. So they allowed me to talk about how I felt when I encountered cases, not just what I saw. And they listened to what I said and gave me feedback about it or asked me further questions about it. And that is very helpful in managing these cases because you're looking at facts, but you're also having feelings. And that piece of it has to go somewhere. And if someone doesn't give you a form for doing it, then it can go into places that, can be complicated. So I was very fortunate. That is not always the case, and I know that, but so that helped me a lot. In terms of other formal structures, when I was doing the work, there weren't really any. Other than there was an EAP program if you wanted to go see a therapist. Other than that, there weren't any. The informal structures, it really kind of goes back to the analogy that I mentioned earlier when I talked about MASH. And I was talking about it then in terms of the kind of, for lack of a better term, gallows humor. But there's also the sense of we are a body of people who understands an experience that nobody else does. And in light of that, here's what we need to do to drag everybody along in that experience. And I'm not saying that it was like one big giant place where everybody did that, but many people did. And that could be something as simple as on the day that you got new cases, which was a very hectic day because there was no predicting whether we were going to get one case or 20 cases, whether they were going to be very simple or they were going to be already homicides. I mean, you just didn't know. So you had this day when you woke up in these, it's almost like en masse where the helicopters came in with the newly injured people. In fact, it was exactly like that. You know, you're sitting there and you're playing cards where they would be playing cards or they would be doing what they're doing, and they would hear incoming people and they had to drop what they were doing and start triaging. It's the same process as the cases came in. I had to triage them based on, yeah, as a supervisor, I had to triage them based on severity. My workers tended to have specialties, and where I could, I would send cases to the staff who I knew would do a more effective job for a particular kind of case, location of the city, age of the child. So you're doing all that. It's like they were triaging bodies for, you know, gaping chest wounds as opposed to a broken leg. So you're doing that. And some of those days, I'd be in at 7:30 and couldn't think about lunch until 4:30 that day. So many times when it was your day to get new cases, somebody would go, do you need me to go get you something to eat? Or you want me to go and get you a cup of coffee, you know, or something like that. Or, you know, have you been to the bathroom? No. Well, I'll cover your phone until you go. You know, well, I'm waiting for a phone call from blah, 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 who's at the hospital checking on blah, blah, blah. I'll stay here. If the call comes in, then I'll get the information and you can call her back. So those kinds of little small things happen. Or there have been times when I've come in and there were flowers on my desk, just because. Or, you know, you've been looking really bad the last couple of days. Let's go to, when we go to this, a friend of ours, it was a particular restaurant we used to go to in Chinatown, because it was just so quiet and kind of, you know, meditative. And we just, it's like, we need to escape. So they dragged me to the restaurant and we sit and, you know, have brown rice and not talk about work. So that kind of stuff. Or just, you know, somebody would just come in and I heard about that case. It's like, you're all right? It's like, yeah, I'm all right. You know, so did that. And sometimes it was just somebody in the hallway stopping for 5 minutes. I mean, it wasn't necessarily great big things, but just things to acknowledge that we do something that people don't really understand. And we don't get a lot of thanks for it. So we have to support and thank each other. Well, part of it, well, retail therapy, really, I wasn't being sarcastic. You know, I have a strong family unit, and so there's always that support system there. And, you know, my faith is very important to me. So that's a time when you need, you know, that kind of spiritual support. And so it helped me because it makes you look at life in a larger context than just the here and now and just the immediate experience. And so a combination of those things and the fact that, quite frankly, I'm just by definition a very resilient person. I bounce back. I have to. I don't know any other way to do it. I knew the people were praying for me. I also had my own prayer practice. The understanding that God is aware of who I am and what I need. And that's a comfort. That He knows when I'm in a place that's challenging and that He will send support for me and will sustain me. That's a comfort for me, always has been. Well, I think that probably the most impactful thing for me as a child welfare worker was an opportunity I got to work um, kind of as an additional job, running support groups for parents and children. And so during that, doing that, it allowed me to see both ends of the spectrum. If you're a child welfare worker, you're looking at a lot of, particularly where I work, the initial contacts and encountering people where the problems began. But by running the support groups, I got to be with pretty much the same people where the solutions are developed and discovered. And so that kind of fed in a very positive way me emotionally and spiritually and professionally, because I got to see people with problems figure out how to manage them, figure out how to improve their relationships, figure out how to do the things they needed to do to change and grow. So it offset some of the things that you encountered when you initially met some families. The support groups usually were basically psychoeducational, which means that part of it was delivering some didactic information about a topic. Maybe it was discipline, maybe it was setting rules, maybe it was communication. But the other piece of it was allowing the participants to actually talk about their experiences. And we also designed experiences for them where they needed to self-reflect. For instance, um, most people parent based on the way they were parented, but that's not always obvious to them. Sometimes we would have them do things where they talked about an experience they had with their own parents and ask them how they felt when their parent responded to them a certain way, and then make the connection between, well, what do you think your child feels like when you do a very similar thing to the thing that your parent did? And so then they gain a little insight, and maybe they'll make a minor correction in how they manage things. And we also did some things, because some of the groups were parents and also children together, not necessarily in the room at the same time, but a group for parents and a group for children. And then some cross communication. So we would teach them simultaneously from the parents' perspective and from the kids' perspective. Here's what communication means. Here's what it means to express what you need in a more supportive and positive way. Here's what it means to express displeasure in a way that's not dramatic or overly emotional. Then we'd have them practice with each other, or things like that. So we try to give them as much real-time experience as we could. And in some of the groups, we also help them to play, because play is a form of communication between parents and children, and play is also how children learn. So we also use those tools whenever we could. We actually had a local art program come in, and they did what were called family sculptures with the parents and the kids. And they just brought in newspaper and other, simple things that meant the parent could recreate it at home if they wanted to. And each family had a project. They actually built things with the newspaper structures. And it was just fun watching them figure out how to do it and seeing how proud they were after they made their piece, and then we kind of had an art show. So they really liked that. And we also, the same local art program, had them come on site, and the parents and the children worked on working with clay, developing like ashtrays or whatever they wanted to do. Then they were fired, and they came back again and got their work. And then we kind of looked at it and discussed it. So we tried to do things where they could be creative and work together, and they really responded positively to it. My favorite case, and I actually see her probably 5 or 6 times a year, was a woman in one of my support groups who started at a very complex place with kids who were not with her. They were in foster care and a host of other issues. And so I think she came to like 3, maybe 4 cycles of the group, and the group ran 12 weeks. And she did amazing work. And it actually got to the place where I think during the third cycle, I told her that I needed to refer her to another group within the same program. And I told her the reason for that is we've gotten too close. And I actually see you more as a friend than as a client, and that's not healthy for each of us. So she was really irritated with me. It's like, this will be the best thing for you. And I do it out of service to you as a person that I believe in, and as a person that is obviously going to be able to make it through all of the things that you have had to overcome, but you're going to have to go. So when I first moved to where I live now, I'm coming out of a store in the area and I see her. And she's living not too far from me, has her own home, has all her kids back, and a couple of those kids had scholarships and were in Ivy League colleges. And she's just, doing all this amazing stuff. And so I keep trying to get her to go back to school. It's like, you need to go to school. You need to go to school. You need to be able to, share what you've done in a different way. And she does. She has the profession now where she kind of does. And what we always talk about that was, no, you need to go to school. So she's like, I know I need to go to school because I see her periodically. And so whenever I see her, we both smile. And I actually forget, the client part. I just see, my neighbor and, how the kids and how's the baby and what you doing now. And that's kind of the conversation. And usually she'll bring up the social service part because she wants to say something about the experience still. But it's like, I just see a person who's overcome a lot. And so she's like my badge for when you do this work, this is what can happen. And it's not that I did so much, I just facilitated what she already had. It was all there. She just needed somebody to listen to her and to care about her. And if you look at the research, when they talk about survival of trauma and resiliency, it's one person who acknowledges you as human and who says or reflects to you that you are capable of doing anything you want to do, can make the difference between surviving and not surviving as an adult, traumatic experiences. So, because it's there, it was there. So, she did it for herself. I just kind of witnessed it and went, hey, every once in a while. Well, they kind of go back to the things that I referred to when you asked me about how did I recover from the fatality. I'm actually a lot better at a lot of stuff. Like I've gotten into kind of fitness more. So I work with a personal trainer and I do that whole deal. And that actually is very helpful for me. I've lost a bunch of weight because I stopped sucking down carbs as a response to stress. And then there's still family and friends, faith. I mean, those things are just, for me, a recipe for recovery. I think understanding, because I do now understand that secondary trauma exists, there's a name for the thing that I was feeling. There was no name. There was just this stuff that happened. And for me, knowledge is always helpful. It gives me a sense of control. It's not this random, unexplained event. There are logical and biological reasons for why I experienced what I experienced that make perfect sense once you connect what I did to the science of trauma. It's like, well, what other way would I be after doing this? And so that for me is helpful. Someone said, I was at a banquet a couple days ago, we were talking about the work, and this person said that the work is fulfilling, but it will never stop asking. So you have to figure out where your boundary is, because it's never going to stop. I don't think there's anything else I can say that's more important than that.